ancestors' diets were rich in the essential vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients needed for optimal health. But today, thanks to declining soil quality, a growing toxic burden, and other challenges in the modern world, most of us are not getting enough of these critical nutrients. That's why I created Adapt Naturals. It's a supplement line based on the principles of evolutionary biology and modern research that closes the nutrient gap so you can feel and perform your best. Unlike most supplements, which use cheap synthetic ingredients your body can't absorb, our products are made with clinician grade, bioavailable ingredients that make a real and noticeable difference. We have a full range of products from the most advanced multivitamin and phytonutrient formula on the market to a blend of 8 organic superfood mushrooms, including reishi, chaga, and lion's mane, to a highly absorbable liquid D3K2 dropper. Our newest product is BioAvail Omega Plus, a blend of ultra-pure fish oil and the most bioavailable forms of curcumin and black seed oil in a single 2 soft gel serving. Fish oil, curcumin, and black seed oil are renowned for their powerful health benefits. But until now, they've only been available in separate products, which means higher cost and a lot of pills. BioAvail Omega Plus gives you a natural and effective way to improve joint and muscle health, boost exercise performance and recovery, elevate mood and mental clarity, and regulate immune function. Head over to adaptnaturals.com, that's ADAPT naturals.com, to learn more and start feeling and performing your best. Hey everybody, Chris Kresser here. Welcome to another episode of Revolution Health Radio. This week, my guest is Dr. Stephan van Vliet, and we are going to dive into recent research on the nutritional differences between grass and grain-fed meat. Now, intuitively, we might suspect that there are significant differences here. We know that for human beings, if a human being changes their diet significantly, then they're going to see differences in their own, biochemical markers that reflect health and differences in blood levels of various compounds based on their diet. And so, of course, we suspect that that's also true for animals that are consuming different diets, grass versus grain feed. And certainly we have had research in the past that gave us some indications here, particularly for essential vitamins and minerals. But what Dr. Van Vliet's group has done is take that to a greater level of resolution. They're looking at essential fatty acid profiles like omega-3 and omega-6, but also saturated fat, but in much more detail. They're looking at carbon chain length and intermediary fatty acids. And then they are also starting to look at the presence of phytonutrients in meat, in grass-fed animals versus grain-fed animals. These are some of the same compounds that we get from eating plants, but it turns out that we may get meaningful amounts of them from eating grass-fed animals. So this was a fascinating conversation, a lot of cutting-edge research here, and some really exciting new insights into the importance of regenerative ranching and methods of raising animals and how that impacts animal health and very likely human health. So let's dive in. Stephan, it's a pleasure to have you back on the show.
I'm glad to be back, Chris. It's been a while.
It has been a while, and you've been busy. I've been really looking forward to talking to you about some of your latest research on grazing practices and how they impact the nutritional composition of meat, because this is something that I've intuitively suspected for a long time. And we didn't really have until fairly recently much data to back up any kind of intuitive suspicions or guesses that we might have had about how grazing impacts the broader nutritional composition. Certainly we had some data on essential vitamins and minerals and fatty acids and things like that, but that's just one part of the nutritional composition of meat, an important part for sure, but not the only consideration. So maybe you could just start by broadly introducing what you've been up to lately and what kinds of nutrients and nutritional profiles you've been looking at in meat in relation to grazing.
Absolutely. So I think since last time that we spoke, I was actually still at Duke University, and I've moved to Utah now. So I'm at the Center for Human Nutrition Studies at Utah State University. It's a great position that opened up here. It's It's kind of like a clinical facility where I'm at. Looks like a doctor's office, so we do a lot of nutrition trials there. But what is nice about the place where I'm at now is that it's also an ag school. So there's this combination of agriculture, human nutrition, and it's really the sort of the field that my research group operates in. So that's been nice. And yeah, we've continued a lot of our projects on, as you mentioned, how different grazing practices impact the nutritional composition of meat. And we don't just study meat. We take a broader look at regenerative agriculture, or we call it agroecology in science, but it's basically agricultural practices such as multi-cropping, lay rotations, where you maybe integrate animals and crops. You have maybe multi-species grazing. So things that by the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, one of the leading bodies on climate change, suggest are practices that can improve the sustainability of agriculture. So essentially what we do in our group is we take a lot of those, or look at a lot of those practices and see, well, do they also translate into a human nutrition benefit and potentially a human health benefit when we consume foods from more sustainable or regenerative systems? And it's really interesting that you noted that, Chris, about intuitively how that would make a difference what you feed an animal, right? And I agree, intuitively it makes sense, but okay, we have to be critical as scientists and look at the data. But sort of, I come at this from a human nutrition standpoint, and we often study people that were on standard American diets or on Mediterranean diets or other whole foods diets, right? And if I'd ask you, Chris, after 3 months on those diets, would you expect a difference in health? You'd probably say yes.
Mm-hmm.
If we do that with a cow, then we put them on pasture for the last 3 months of their life or in a feedlot, one could expect to see differences there too, right? Because it's two completely different diets. And if we do that with lab mice, we expect differences. But for some reason, for a long time with animals, we did not think there would be differences. But yeah, I mean, a cow is a mammal, just like a human. And if you put them on two completely different diets, being on a grain-based ration in a feedlot or grazing outside on a large number of plants, you get a very much different nutritional profile, and also an animal metabolic health profile.
Absolutely. I mean, it's common sense, but as you said, that's not enough if you want to be rigorous in your scientific approach. Just to apply common sense, you have to do the research to back it up, and that's exactly what you've been working on. So tell us a little bit about some of the recent work you've been up to.
So we've been working on a project that we started. I don't know if we started already last time we talked, but it's called the Beef Nutrient Density Project. Basically, we are working directly with farmers, where we source a lot of beef from, sort of the supply chain. And we also buy beef in stores, grass-fed, grain-fed. We work with some smaller feedlots that may not feed as much grain or have shorter finishing periods. But basically, the goal of that project is to look at 250 farms, 750 steaks, so 3 steaks per farm, and to look at the source of nutritional variation and what is causing that variation. And what we are seeing so far, Chris, is that on average, we see that the omega-6 to 3 ratio is improved in grass-fed beef, as you would expect. It's about 3 to 1. So for every omega-6, 3 omega-6s, there's 1 omega-3. In the feedlot system, we see that it's about 10 to 1. But it is also important to notice that there's huge variation, about an 11-fold variation in the grass-fed beef systems. And what we're seeing initially in our data is that definitely the ranchers that use these agroecological practices, such as rotational grazing on biodiverse pastures, moving the animals around regularly, not overgrazing on the pasture, they end up with the most favorable omega-6 to 3 ratios. We also typically see that the animals are in good metabolic health. We can tell that by the meat as well, looking at, for instance, oxidative stress markers, and also the phytochemicals, the plant secondary compounds that are thought to largely have anti-inflammatory and antioxidant effects, certainly to the animal. Whether it has so to humans from consuming meat is up in the air at the moment, but okay, animal health is improved. We see that those are also the highest when people have used these regenerative or rotational grazing practices amongst grass-fed beef systems. When animals are grazing more monoculture pastures or they're overgrazing the pasture, we see a reduction in the nutrient density. And then sort of the lowest amounts of these quote unquote beneficial compounds, omega-3s, phytochemicals, long chain saturated fatty acids, B vitamins, they're typically a little bit reduced in the feedlot finished animals.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Again, it's one ecosystem where all of these different parts influence the whole. And we've had a lot of ranchers on the show over the past couple of years talking about the regenerative practices that you're referring to and why they're so important for animal health, for ecosystem, local environment health, and then, of course, ultimately human health from consuming animals that have better nutritional profiles. With that in mind, like an 11-fold variation is really significant. How would you say that the grass-fed animals that were done in the most conventional way, let's say, were close to feedlot animals, or was there still a difference?
Yeah, no, that's a good question, Chris. And I cannot stick my hand in the fire for it, but my gut feeling tells me is that those animals were fed grains and they weren't truly grass fed. That's what I think, because I mean that's what the data suggests. And to be fair, these were samples that we just bought in grocery stores. So unfortunately, that means also that we don't have insight into their practices per se. I mean, and obviously we know the brand, but we keep this all sort of de-identified, obviously. But yeah, looking at that data, to me, it suggests that these animals were not like grass fed, and because sometimes they even had worse omega-6 to 3 ratios than your average feedlot beef. And but I must say, the farmers that we worked with directly, or they sent in samples and filled out their management data, and they, the ones that use these quote unquote rotational grazing practices, agroecological practices, or regenerative practices, as people often say, yeah, those rose to the top in terms of a lot of these farmers had omega-6 to 3 ratios that were closer to 1-to-1 and 2-to-1. So that's kind of considered the gold standard, really. And they also ended up with high amounts of phytochemicals, plant secondary compounds. And one thing we also noticed is that niacin, vitamin B3, was also elevated in many of these farmers, and yeah, suggesting that. And we know that the fresh forages provide the precursors to that vitamin. So those were things that we noticed, and we also noticed, and this was also kind of surprising to me initially, but then looking back on it, it cannot be too surprising because we were so focused in the field on omega-3 fatty acids that we did not really look at saturated fatty acids properly in the past. But what we're seeing in polyunsaturated fatty acids, we see these very long chain ones, such as EPA and DHA and ALA and DPA. We see those getting enriched. So the very long chain polyunsaturated fatty acids. Well, we see the same thing with saturated fatty acids. The very long chain ones, such as behanic acid, for instance, or nonodecanoic acid. So it's C18 and up for the sort of the listeners that have an idea on the carbon lengths of these fatty acids. But these long chain ones, they're up as a result of forage-based diets. And what is interesting is that, at least in epidemiological studies, higher amounts, circulating amounts of these very long chain saturated fatty acids are often neutral or associated with a decreased risk of cardiovascular disease and diabetes. So yeah, certainly is interesting. And then another avenue to explore is that saturated fat isn't saturated fat either. And there's a concern regarding saturated fat from beef and red meat, and we can go into that too, whether that is always justified. But anyway, we do see a more quote unquote, at least on paper, favorable saturated fatty acid profile too. And that was something that was not on my radar.
That's really interesting. I want to come back to that, but I also want to touch on the phytochemicals briefly, because I think this is something that, correct me if I'm wrong, was novel with your research, or at least it seems like I might have seen in one other paper. I could be imagining that, but I'm interested in this. Like you said, we don't know whether consuming these phytochemicals in meat has any human health effects. We do know that it does seem to benefit the animal. And again, just applying common sense, a healthier animal, all other things being equal, will probably lead to better nutritional profile and composition, and healthier human if they're eating that animal. But what do we know about, maybe you could give some examples of these phytochemicals and what we know about how they're impacting the animal's health, and if there's anything at all so far that's been published in terms of the human health effects of phytonutrients in meat. Because of course, the common wisdom is you can only get phytonutrients from plants, from eating plant foods. And if it's true that we can get phytonutrients as well from consuming animal foods, that's a pretty big shift in what, the dominant kind of paradigm or idea about nutrition.
Yeah, that's true, Chris. And you can get phytonutrients from drinking breast milk as well. So
Right.
because and whether it's breast milk from as a baby from a nursing mother, certainly not saying you should drink breast milk as an adult, but my point being is, if you can find this in breast milk of mothers that consume a diet rich in fruits and vegetables, and it's transferred to the baby like that, it's not that weird to think that if you feed a phytochemically rich diet to a cow, that its milk and meat gets enriched in these phytochemicals. So phytochemicals are secondary metabolites of plants. We call them secondary because for the longest time we had no idea what they did. So we thought they weren't important. They are not essential to the plant's survival from sort of a metabolism standpoint, but I would argue that without these phytochemicals, which are often plant defense mechanisms against overgrazing. So sometimes, a plant likes to maybe be nibbled a little bit, but not eaten fully. So certain alkaloids, or it's protecting itself from UV light or water stress, so drought. So a lot of times these are plant defense mechanisms, but there are also sort of volatile compounds, fragrance, that attract animals to eat them. So it has a dual role. But these plant phytochemicals, they are typically also noted as antioxidants. So all phytochemicals, or most phytochemicals, have a hydroxyl group, and that means that they are antioxidants. So they can serve as antioxidants, most of them at least, when animals consume them, and also when we consume them. And it's really a novel area of research for sure. I mean, I often compare it to, I wasn't alive clearly, but I teach a course in advanced micronutrient metabolism, where we go a lot over the history of how these vitamins were discovered. And this was about 100 years ago. And, there were rapid discoveries about vitamins, how they impacted metabolism. And I feel like we're a little bit at that stage now with phytochemicals. It is in its infancy. There's probably hundreds of thousands of these compounds, but we have identified major ones. And these are things that are often named after the food that they're rich in. So we have major one is cinnamic acid. It is rich in cinnamon, but it's almost found in every plant. We have caffeic acid, benzoic acid. These are all common phytochemicals that are found within plants, but also animals and then humans. And what is interesting about those is that, yes, if you consume a more phytochemically rich diet, whether you're a human or an animal, that we have higher amounts of these. So, and what is particularly, I think, interesting, some of the findings that we're making regarding animal-sourced foods, animals, especially ruminants, consume forages or vegetation that you and I cannot consume.
Mm-hmm.
They might be toxic to us, or they might be too fibrous, but they may also contain certain beneficial or medicinal compounds. And that is a way of further providing these to us in our diet. And then, of course, it also further increases the overall phytochemical richness of our diet.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something I've always argued, is that, cattle can transform plant foods that we can't consume because of our different physiology into compounds that are beneficial for us. So they do a lot of that hard work for us, and we benefit from it. And this seems to be potentially another area where that's also true. And I find it particularly interesting in light of the recent popularity of the carnivore diet, and a lot of discussion around, well, if we look at traditional cultures historically, to my knowledge, we don't know of a single one that only ate animal foods, like 100% exclusively animal foods, nor do we know of one that ate exclusively plant foods. And it seems that, just judging from this ancestral template, that some combination of plant and animal food seems to be best for most people. And that's a controversial statement these days, but that's my belief. But it is interesting to me that I've often wondered, well, if that's true, we also know that some people are thriving on or at least appear to be thriving from all the ways that we can measure that, both subjectively and objectively, on a carnivore diet. And if these phytonutrients are so beneficial to health, which so many studies do suggest that they are, how do you resolve that apparent contradiction? And maybe, we don't know yet, but maybe this is one potential way of resolving that contradiction, that actually people are getting phytonutrients. They're just getting them from animal foods instead of plant foods.
Yeah, no, I agree, Chris, and that's certainly true. But although I do want to make it crystal clear, is that a plant is a better source of phytochemicals than a piece of meat or milk. So I always say that a carrot is a better source of beta carotene than grass-fed beef is. And I agree that people that are on animal-based diets or on carnivore diets are likely to get some of these phytochemicals in from animal-sourced foods. But yeah, they're not getting it in to the extent that someone on a mixed diet, on an omnivorous diet would, that includes plenty of fruits and vegetables as well. And I'm with you, Chris, is that I think for the vast majority of the population, I think they operate best on a sort of a spectrum of omnivory, having both plant and animal source foods. But it is true that you always have outliers, that a certain portion of the population seems to be thriving on vegan diets, and a certain portion, and I know we have less data on that, and it's more self-reported, but seems to be in good health on an animal-based diet. And I always question whether that means that we should extrapolate that on to how the entire population should eat. I don't know what your feelings are about it, but I don't think that every vegan that failed a vegan diet is because they didn't do the diet right. I mean, we know there's intra-individual differences in nutrient metabolism from many different studies on how you metabolize even things such as iron or carotenoids and tocopherols, precursors to vitamin A and E. But yeah, to me, it always points to the following. It's just the incredible resilience as a human being that we can be on a vegan diet or on a carnivore diet and still be alive.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with you. I've spoken a lot about this in the past and have experienced it firsthand when I tried a vegan diet many years ago, and also with many, many patients that I've worked with and many clinicians I've trained that have worked with patients as well. So I have a pretty broad perspective on this that's backed up by a lot of lab testing and data. I think there is such huge inter-individual variation in responses to vegan diets for all of the reasons that you mentioned, is that plants contain a lot of precursor nutrients, and those nutrients often need to be converted into the most active forms to be, for us to get the full benefits. So carotenes are a good example. They get converted into retinol. K1 gets converted into K2. You have the alpha linolenic acid, the essential fatty acids like linoleic acid and alpha linolenic acid get converted into the downstream EPA and DHA. Or AA, in the case of omega-6s, you've got all of these conversions happening all of the time. And those conversions often involve multi-step enzymatic pathways. And each of those enzymes at each of those steps requires the presence of certain nutrients, which often are underrepresented on a vegan diet. But if you have someone who just genetically is, or because they're doing a better job at sourcing nutrients, is really efficiently making those conversions, then they could potentially do quite well because they're still getting all of the downstream active forms of all of the nutrients in adequate amounts. Whereas if you have somebody who, for either genetic or nutritional reasons, is not making those conversions efficiently, then that person can start to struggle almost immediately in some cases. In others, it might take a few months, or in still others, it could take even longer. And that's what makes this so tricky, because one person might, start a vegan diet and have a really great experience, and then someone else starts it and they feel like they got hit by a bus, And the person who had a great experience naturally thinks, well, you must not be doing it right because I started it and I feel great. But of course, it's not that simple. And I would just say that, yes, it's possible for some people to do well on a 100% plant based diet, but you introduce a lot of risk that wouldn't be there if you're consuming an omnivorous diet where you're also eating preformed, the active preformed version of the nutrients like retinol or K2, or EPA and DHA instead of just ALA. So that's kind of my take on it. If you've listened to this show for a while, you know that I'm a super active guy. Depending on the time of year, I'm either skiing, mountain biking, hiking, backpacking, surfing, or lifting weights on most days of the week. I also live in a really dry climate at high elevation. For these reasons, I pay a lot of attention to hydration. I've learned the hard way what happens when I get dehydrated, and I know how important hydration is to overall health. But hydration isn't just about drinking water, it's about water plus electrolytes. This is where Element comes in. It's a combination of electrolytes like sodium, potassium, and magnesium in easy to use individual packets that you just add right to your water bottle. And unlike most electrolyte products on the market, Element is free of sugar and artificial junk. I drink Element every day, and it's made a huge difference in how I feel. Even with my training and profession, I don't think I realized how often I was dehydrated before I made Element part of my daily routine. If you'd like to try it, the folks at Element have an exclusive offer for my podcast listeners. You can get a free sample pack with one of each of the 8 flavors Element sells when you purchase any Element product. This is perfect for anyone who wants to try all of the flavors or who wants to introduce a friend to Element. Just go to kresser.co/element, that's LMNT, to place an order and take advantage of this offer. I'm so excited to tell you about a new product we just launched at Adapt Naturals. Fish oil, curcumin, and black seed oil are renowned for their powerful health benefits. But until now, they've only been available in separate products, which means higher cost and a lot of pills. What's more, many fish oils on the market are rancid or contain toxins like heavy metals and PCBs. And curcumin and black seed oil are not well absorbed unless special preparations are used. BioVail Omega Plus combines the purest and freshest fish oil with the most bioavailable forms of curcumin and black seed oil, so you get the incredible benefits of these nutrients in a single 2 soft gel serving. Those benefits include supporting joint and muscle health. You can boost your performance and recovery and feel more youthful and vital. Improving cognitive function and mood. Sharpen your focus and memory and recover that spring in your step. Promoting metabolic and heart health, which helps maintain normal weight, blood sugar, and cholesterol levels. And regulating immune function, which reduces immune hyperactivity and strengthens protection against viruses and other pathogens. This is an incredible product for anyone who needs extra support with inflammation, pain, joint issues, autoimmunity, cognitive function and mood, and metabolic and heart health. We're running a limited time special as part of the launch of BioVail Omega Plus. You can save 20% off your first order of this product through Sunday, July 23rd. Visit adaptnaturals.com, that's ADAPTNATURALS.com, to place your order and experience the incredibly powerful benefits of fish oil, curcumin, and black seed oil in BioVail Omega Plus.
Yeah, and it made me think of an important point, Chris, when you mentioned that also about like the conversion, and because it's oftentimes something that we hear also on these phytochemicals, and we don't fully understand the pathways yet. But because you know you have we know there's a flavonoid pathway, for instance, within plants where you might start all the way with amino acids, right? Because you start with phenylalanine and tyrosine, and it's converted into cinnamic acid, fumaric acid. These are common major phytochemicals, naringenin, and from there on it goes down to flavonones, isoflavones, anthocyanidins, right, which are red to purple. They give the berries their nice color. And what we see though also in sort of the literature is that people with a low baseline intake, when you then increase it, they have a benefit. I mean, there was a randomized controlled trial that recently came out in PNAS that looked at, I think it was about 3,500 people, and people with low baseline intake of flavonols improved cognitive function over several years, not ones that are already had high intake. So that's also common to see. And also, what's important to know is that incredible variation amongst people, because even if you, for instance, give a labeled phytochemical to someone, so basically it has a sort of it has a 13 carbon label on it. I won't get too technical, but it's like putting a flag on that phytochemical, giving it to someone, and then tracing it to the body. Now and this is also speaks to the fact that usually people say, oh, these things have low bioavailability. Well, I do not agree with that 100%, because what you see is that, let's say if you take fumaric acid as the parent compound and you have that labeled, well, what you see is you start enriching 20, 30 other compounds in the blood of people. So there must be some conversion, probably by our gut microbiota, perhaps even in our liver, that then actually starts to enrich or produce other compounds or other antioxidants that have a beneficial effect. And some studies would suggest that the bioavailability of the parent compound may only be 1%, but if you look at all these other phytochemicals, it may be like 13%, 15%, and they are measurable in our blood for 48 hours. So, and within that, they may, go into our cells and for our brain or an escape again. This is still very much a novel area of interest, but what you do see, and what you also see there, is the variation amongst people, right? And it again comes back to, even with phytochemicals, if you're very efficient in metabolizing these, that's why maybe some people might have more benefit for than others, and perhaps some carnivores are very efficient in maintaining these phytochemicals and using them. I mean, we don't know, but my point being is that I'd say there is now data that is exciting about phytochemicals, because also the Eat Right Foundation for the first time came out with a recommendation on the amounts of flavonols that we should eat. And I think it was about 600 milligrams a day. And it was based on a meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. I think they looked at, I think it was like 120 or something like that. So, I mean, we are certainly learning more and more about these phytochemicals, and starting to learn that, hey, they do impact, signaling pathways. For instance, one thing to note is that, if you take a tumor cell and you put phytochemicals on it, you typically see a decrease in tumor growth. Or if you have pancreatic beta cells, and you see that it impacts insulin production and things like that. So how they do so in vivo in the human body, we don't know a lot yet, but it is likely that they are impacting our health. And the same thing with animals. What we see is that animals are more phytochemically rich diets, they have less oxidative stress. And on paper, that meat looks healthier, but whether that has an appreciable impact on human health, that's something that we are studying in multiple randomized controlled trials now.
Yeah, so fascinating. I want to circle back to something we were talking about earlier, which is fatty acid profile in meat, and the fact that the ranches they're using the most regenerative practices are probably getting closer to 2-to-1 or even 1-to-1 omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, which is probably closer to the historical ratio of these fats that we consume before industrial seed oils were widely introduced into the diet. Do you think that if someone is eating, like, take a hypothetical person who's exclusively eating meat from a regenerative ranch that's in that 1-to-1, 2-to-1 ratio, I haven't done the math on this yet, but would that, if they were just consuming meat and not much seafood, would they be getting enough omega-3s to meet the recommended amounts just from that beef-based diet?
Yeah, I mean, there is some modeling work, Chris, in Australian populations and in Irish populations. It's a combination of modeling work based on intake, but it would suggest that people that eat a decent amount of meat, I mean, carnivores obviously probably eat a couple of pounds, a few pounds a day, I think. But what these studies would suggest in more omnivorous populations, that people that eat, let's say, 3-4 ounces a day or so, that it can have a meaningful contribution to their omega 3 intake and can be up to 30 milligrams or so of combined DHA, EPA, and DPA. And so there's no official recommendations for the amount of omega-3s that we should eat, right? Most groups recommend anywhere from like 100, 200, 300 milligrams, although at least in coastal populations, even currently, they might go higher than that, especially in Sardinia or some of the Japanese that are consuming more fish. They might have an intake that is closer to a gram or so even. But my point is there are some studies to suggest that, yes, these omega-3s can contribute meaningfully, especially in populations that eat a lot of grass-fed meat, such as Australians and the Irish. And there was a nice study that came out, I think, a year or so ago from Hannah Ritchie in Newcastle. And she, based on population intake data in the UK, had modeled that, about 30-40% or so of daily intake recommended by a European agency could be met by eating grass-fed meat alone, right? And that does not even include eggs and this was only beef, I must say, but it doesn't even include eggs or pork or other milk for that matter. So yeah, I definitely think it's possible. I mean, is there a benefit to eating fish? Yes, absolutely. I mean, fatty fish is a very rich source of DHA and EPA. So I would, if you ask me personally, then yeah, I would opt for eating fish a few times a week too. But we eat meat more often probably than fish, at least most people. So if we eat that from pasture systems, then yes, I think it can contribute meaningfully. And again, I don't know I don't have the data, but my hypothesis would be if you had a carnivore person that was eating grain-fed meat versus grass-fed meat, is that the blood omega-6 to 3 ratio of the person eating grass-fed beef would look a whole lot better.
Absolutely. I just think it's interesting because, again, it's another paradigm shift, right? Historically, most sources would not list beef as a meaningful contributor to omega-3 fat in the long chain omega-3 fat intake, and it still isn't in many cases, right? We're talking about meat that's raised in a particular way, and if someone's just the average person's going to the average grocery store and buying the average cut of beef, they're not going to get this benefit. So this is not applicable to the vast majority of beef that people are encountering in the grocery store at this time. But we both know that there's a lot happening here in this space, and a lot of people are becoming more and more aware of the benefits of regeneratively raised beef, and people are seeking it out, and they're ordering it directly from ranches, or getting it at farmers market, or they're buying it from some, in some cases, online directly from ranches, even outside of their local area. So as this continues to progress, which I hope it does, this will become more relevant. And I'm with you. I've been a big advocate for consuming wild-caught, sustainably raised fish and shellfish, particularly the cold water fatty fish and some of the shellfish like oysters, really rich source of EPA and DHA. But beyond that, also a very rich source of bioavailable protein, selenium, and many other nutrients. So you get more than just the fatty acids. For any number of reasons, many people do not consume enough seafood to really move the needle. It could be because they just don't like seafood. I've had a lot of patients in the past who just don't care for fish or shellfish. Could be an access issue, either financially, or they live somewhere where they just don't really have access to fresh fish or shellfish. Some people have environmental concerns. And, there are lots of reasons that people don't get enough. And so I'm excited by the possibility that properly raised or well-raised beef could actually make a contribution for these folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know, Chris, from I think there's I had probably 8 to 10 randomized controlled trials now that find that if you eat pastured meat, and these are studies not just in beef. I think there's like 2 or 3 are in beef. There's one study even in horse meat. But the point being is that what they see in various randomized controlled trials is that the blood omega-3 profile goes up when people eat grass-fed meat, and then the control is usually grain-fed meat, and there the blood omega-3 profile doesn't go up. And this was already known, I think, in the 90s, because Sinclair was a researcher out of Australia. He did a lot of that initial work with where he would compare grass-fed beef and kangaroo and even whitefish to look at, okay, what is the impact on the blood omega-3 profiles? And what he shows is that, yeah, they do go up. Even with grass-fed beef and kangaroo, which is also pastured, of course, pasture finished, and it's a wild animal. And with grain-fed beef, you do not see this going up. So you do see these meaningful contribution. And I often get this sort of thrown in my face too. They say, oh, it's just a few milligrams of omega-3s that are in beef. And if you compare it to salmon, it's meaningless. Well, yeah, but studies would suggest that it does go up meaningfully. And I think also, and this is something we do not fully understand, but I think it comes back to the food matrix, Chris, is that when you ingest these compounds as part of a complex food matrix with a bunch of cofactors, typically the effect is stronger than what you would expect. A very common example of this is vitamin D. If we take a pill of vitamin D at the exact same amount as something that a food source contains, the food source is about 5 to 10 times more efficient in raising vitamin D, probably because of the cofactors or some preformed factors that are there. And I suspect something similar is going on too when we eat things such as DHA, EPA, and other omega-3 fatty acids in a complex food source.
Yeah, absolutely. This is another actually Australian researcher whose work I've really come to appreciate over the years. I think his name's Georgi Skrinis, and he talks about nutritionism, and he talks about food synergy and how important food synergy is. And this is a great example where we don't often think about all of the nutrients, cofactors, enzymes that are required to metabolize a specific nutrient. And when we isolate it and turn it into a supplement, you aren't always getting those other nutrients, especially if you're not combining them in an intelligent way. You used the vitamin D example. That's a classic one. Another is copper and iron. I've had lots of patients over the years who had kind of inexplicable iron deficiency that didn't respond to iron supplementation. And then we would test them and find out that they were copper deficient. And copper is required for iron metabolism. You fix the copper deficiency, then all of a sudden they're not iron deficient anymore. And vitamin C enhances iron absorption, magnesium enhances the metabolism of vitamin D, and vice versa. So there's all these really complex synergies that are happening, some of which we understand, many of which we don't. And this is yet another reason that eating whole foods or taking supplements that are whole food based is a lot better than isolated synthetic nutrients in general.
Yeah, I know, and it's correct, Chris, and it also sort of brings me back to like the lipid peroxidation, for instance. I mean, if you have more, we know this from vitamin E, right? If you that's why a lot of polyunsaturated source with polyunsaturated fats also contain a good amount of vitamin E because it protects the peroxidation of those long chain fatty acids. So, and something similar is probably going on too with when you ingest a good amount of phytochemicals with it. So that could be another reason why grass-fed beef results in a further rise of that, is because you're not oxidizing those lipids as much, or because you have a bunch of phytochemicals that act as antioxidants that come with it in the package, right?
Hmm.
And that is something you often don't have in supplements. And I agree. I mean, we know this from countless research also on things like turmeric and curcumin, right? Curcumin being
Yes.
the main ingredient, and then we take that out and then do a total antioxidant assay, and all of a sudden it's much less effective. So you see this all the time, and yeah, that's why I think always, yeah, food first approach is always what I would suggest. And the further I get into this work, also it makes me realize how little we do know. We're really scratching the surface.
Yeah. And that's both humbling and exciting, because there's a lot that we can still understand, and that knowledge that we're gaining has already led to some meaningful changes in how we look at things. Along those lines, a lot of the research we've had so far that's evaluating health response to grass-fed versus grain-fed meat has been observational in nature. And I think anyone who's been listening to this show for any length of time knows what the problems are there. Certainly, good for generating hypotheses and can be very helpful, especially when when those epidemiological trials are well designed and in such a way that they try to at least attempt to control for potentially confounding factors. But it's almost impossible to control for all of them and even know what all of them are in a particular context. So randomized controlled trials can be helpful because they can take another step in eliminating confounders and give us more reliable data. So last time we talked, you dropped a hint that there might be some randomized controlled trials coming our way looking at this. How does consuming grass-fed meat impact our health versus grain-fed meat? So do you have any updates there?
Well, the only update is that we're pretty deep into the study now, but we haven't have any data yet on it. But yeah, we are doing a study, at least a very acute study right now. So postprandial study. So just the acute, people come in, they eat an Impossible Burger, they eat feedlot beef, or they eat grass-fed beef from a very diverse operation. So the grass-fed beef that we feed them has about a ratio of 1 to 1. We use feedlot beef and then an Impossible Burger too as a third arm. And I think we've completed about 30 people now, and I think we're completing about 40 people. So we have 10 to go. But they basically come in 3 separate occasions. They eat an Impossible Burger, grass-fed beef, or grain-fed beef. We pull blood from them for 5 hours. We collect their urine, and we want to see how it impacts their metabolite profiles, because some of these phytochemicals you can measure pretty quickly already in a few hours afterwards, and you can measure oxidative stress markers. Obviously, we can't say anything about long-term health, but we're doing that initial study to give us some biomarker data, and then we're following that up with a longer term trial where we feed people for several weeks. So that's a study that is going on. And then we do have a study going on that is somewhat analogous to that. It's a study with the Green Acres Foundation, and we've sourced all of our foods from regenerative agriculture. So these are all the plant foods and animal source foods, or we source the exact same produce just from the grocery store, so non-organic produce, so which is typically produced using more monoculture crops. So that's also a study that we're about halfway through with. But yeah, randomized control trials, you typically need enough people and enough time for something to happen, if there is a difference at least. And so those are some of the major studies that we have ongoing in terms of randomized control trials. So unfortunately, no real big updates yet, but we are going to publish our work that we talked about, I think, the last time. We're going to publish it this year, hopefully, where we compared a whole foods diet versus a standard American diet. Also trying to match for at least food groups as much as possible. So if someone would get some broccoli with butter, we'd go to the grocery store and find the broccoli and butter sauce with the 30 more ingredients. And so those are examples of meals, and we get potatoes with some olive oil, or fries, or things like that, oven fries, to look at if you eat the same foods and match for protein, for carbohydrates, for fat, for calories. Because a lot of the idea about ultra-processed foods right now is that the reason why you get unhealthy is because you overeat. What Kevin Hall's study would suggest. Well, we try to match for calories in this study, and what we found is that people on the whole foods diet got healthy quite rapidly. They saw a reduction in triglycerides of about 30-40% in a month. And the people on the standard American diet, they kind of stayed the same because they were consuming a standard American diet going into the study. So that's one study that we will be publishing this year, and it would suggest that the problems with ultra-processed foods are kind of independent of sort of the caloric piece or the energy piece, but just eating them in general is problematic.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I look forward to that research when it becomes available. We'll have you back on to talk about it. And thanks so much for joining me today. I think this is a really fascinating new line of inquiry where we're learning so much more about at such a greater level of resolution, I would say, about the nutritional differences between grass-fed and grain-fed meat. And it's, again, I think intuitively many of us suspected this, but it's really important to have the data that backs it up. And even within that data, we're all learning something new, maybe some some surprises or some things that we might not have suspected, which is why it's so important to do the research.
Absolutely, Chris. I'm always surprised too about some of these findings that we make, and then I'm like, oh yeah, but that I had not expected that. But that's what keeps exciting, of course.
Exactly. Well, thanks, Stephan, again. And where can people learn more about your work?
So on Twitter, I'm at Van Vliet PhD. So my last name and then the letters PhD. And that if you type in my name on Google or YouTube, there's many webinars that and invited talks that I've given over time where I go through some of the slides on some of the work that we talk about with grass-fed beef and Google Scholar profile, and we also always pay for open access fees so that our papers can be read by anyone really, rather than it end up being behind a paywall and 100 scientists read it instead of a broader audience.
I really appreciate that about your research, and I know a lot of my citizen scientist listeners do as well. So thank you for doing that. I wish more researchers did do that. I know it's not always easy to do. So really props to you guys for doing that with your papers. Thanks everyone for listening. Keep sending your questions, chriskresser.com/podcast question, and we'll talk to you next time. That's the end of this episode of Revolution Health Radio. If you appreciate the show and want to help me create a healthier and happier world, please head over to iTunes and leave us a review. They really do make a difference. If you'd like to ask a question for me to answer on a future episode, you can do that at chriskresser.com/podcast question. You can also leave a suggestion for someone you'd like me to interview there. If you're on social media, you can follow me at twitter.com/chriskresser or facebook.com/chriskresserlac. I post a lot of articles and research that I do throughout the week there that never makes it to the blog or podcast, so it's a great way to stay abreast of the latest developments. Thanks so much for listening. Talk to you next time.